research, a research fellow at Max Planck Institute in Germany for the study of religious and ethnic diversity, and a visiting scholar for the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. We're delighted to have him here with us at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies to discuss his new book, The Politics of Secularism, Religion, Diversity, and Institutional Change in France and Turkey. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me here. I would like to advance a special thanks to everybody who actually do a lot of effort to organize this event, the center. Thank you, the center. Thank you very much. The politics of secularism engages with roughly three different kinds of debates. One, the recent rising turn after 9/11, especially in the secularism literature, what we can roughly describe as multiple secularism. In other words, the effect of multiple modernities approach on the literature on secularism. Institutionalist theory, particularly the question on how to assess and find the role of ideas in questions of institutional change. And also post-colonial theory, the big debate in ecological terms between the analytical and the hermeneutical schools. And as a starting out this comparison as a area specialist, in fact, I was empathizing much more with the hermeneutical approaches. That is, we have to look at more closely to local meanings. We have to really make sure that we don't get this typical critique when we engage in comparison from the area specialist, which says, well, that is not how it works in Turkey. So I aimed at the comparison while in fact trying to satisfy the area specialists. But in a really interesting way, my attempt to really lay out all these details, meanings, and all that ended up, to my surprise as well, with a title called The Politics of Secularism. And I actually will today give you some of the themes in this book, share with you some of the material, but I also would like to tell that I won't be able to do all, and there are a lot of themes in the book and traces that I did not throw out because my framework wasn't encompassing them all, and the book is more like a dialogue with many other approaches, and it also has many clues of further research. Starting with the last debate I laid out between the analytical and the hermeneutical schools, just a little note on the significance of the comparison of France and Turkey. If you recall, in Provincializing Europe, Chakrabarty basically says that this is not a book about Europe. I hope Europe is already provincialized. This is a book about the idea of Europe outside Europe. Well, maybe among anthropologists and historians, but I really don't think that Europe has been provincialized in political science. And that is actually one reason why I was so eager to go to 19th century France and to dig out all this material on how certain major moments like the public, the education law and law separation was put in place. And this, in fact, was also a problem in the literature on secularism. In other words, I didn't just go in that direction because I wanted to be in a dialogue with post-colonial studies, but in fact, the literature on secularism, the area specialist literature since 60s onwards, I would say, was producing a certain kind of argument. This argument was, there is a difference between Europe and Turkey. This can be Europe understood in a very general way, or this can be Europe understood in a particular way, such as the case of France. There are institutional differences. The main differences would be that there is separation, let's say, in France, but the Turkish state still pays the salaries of the imams. So how are we going to deal with this difference? And basically a sociological explanation comes in to kind of argue why there's a difference, and the way out is to reconceptualize secularism. For example, Niyazi Berker's 1960s, secularism as union in Turkey, secularism as separation in France. So the academic, the scholar, the observer starts producing all these binaries in order to make sense of a sociological difference of some sort. So that was the one reason that I thought, well, it would be more interesting to actually find a way out of this problem that we always try to make sense of or give meaning to differences that we don't know otherwise. And one way out of that was to extend the period of comparison, because in the 19th century the French state was paying for the clerics. So rather than trying to give meaning to differences that we are stuck with, why don't we just look at moments in France where there's actually more overlap between the Turkish case and the French case. The second analytical move was basically to look at institutional change. I mean, I say this from experience working on moments of institutional change for a while, that these moments are special because they embody lost options. And those lost options are very important in laying out the politics of secularism, because something that doesn't reflect on the outcome might actually be there in the struggle for those institutions, but just falls out sometimes in the conclusion. The third analytical move was to kind of follow through a disclaimer that Weber, in fact, had in the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. And the disclaimer was in a book that actually everybody cites in order to mark the role of ideas in history. Weber actually is much more hesitant than the Hegelians. Weber says, actually, my thesis is something that the ethnographer can object. Because if you recall, in the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, there isn't a single Protestant. It's all about a correlation of doctrine and certain developments. This is what I call the Weber's gap, which in fact, I mean, I won't follow this now, but a gap that Clifford Geertz filled very successfully later onwards. So, how to deal with that gap? And my way of dealing with that gap is the problem with the looking at the role of ideas in history is it's actually very unclear what a definition of an idea is. So therefore, I looked at arguments, very long, detailed arguments at moments of institutional change. What are the causalities? What are the expectations of certain political actors? And it actually turned out that there's a lot of similarities, overlaps in the political field in the 19th century, as well as today, as well as in France, and as well as in Turkey. These are the four puzzles, specific puzzles that I work with. How did the 1882 law on education pass? This was the law on public education in France, and it's one of the cornerstones of laicity. How did the law of separation pass in 1905? And please note, in 1902, the same parliament did not want to pass that law. So much for sociological explanation, unless you're going to argue that in 3 years the sociology of France changed. And what is also very important is that the law, in fact, passed by a margin of 108 votes. So if 55 votes changed sides, that law would not have passed. Number two, again, a question that really helps me flesh out this question on Weber's gap between ideas and action. In contemporary France, some proponents of religion courses in public schools, in fact, emerged from the opponents of the headscarf. This is actually a very crucial observation because the last decade of discussion in Europe narrates all the discussion and struggle over secularism over the headscarf. Whereas when you look at multiple issue areas, there are much more complicated positions. And such complicated positions also do exist in Turkey. Number three, why is Turkey still stuck with this state salaries for imams? Four, the AKP, before coming to office, sometimes aired the idea of separation, and while in office actually organized outreach meetings with religious minorities, but still at the end reaffirmed and strengthened the institution of salaried imams and tripled the number of religion courses in public schools. Now, because I'm traveling through so many different moments, I really concentrated on the question of religion courses and on the question of state salaries for clerics, because that was the only way, by keeping that focus, I was travel and make that multi-sided comparison possible. So there may be other important issues, but I was really trying to keep this as a consistent comparison. Now, if I just go a little into detail about each of these and give you a sense of the material as well, this is the law of 1882, and in fact, what my first observation working with this law and its making was today, for example, a question like optional religion courses in school, we look at it as a more softer issue. There are more important issues. However, when the struggle is between monarchists and republicans, it's not a soft issue at all. Because the monarchists are not only challenging that it's optional, they're challenging that it's a course, because religion has to be everywhere. And the Republican report actually on this, from of the commission in the making of this law has the largest section on the courses. So for them, it is the issue. This is from the report. This is the Beck report. Paul Beck was the head of the Commission on Education. And at the end of the day, this law decided on religion courses, optional, outside school hours, and outside school grounds. And today in France, this is a law in effect. And today in France, still the school day is 4 days. There's 1 day where you can go to church or you can play soccer. And if you look at this passage that I underlined, is actually a passage about diversity. In other words, the Republican school is important so that we all, as different citizens, can sit together in the same benches. Now, this was a moment when I first encountered this, and this theme actually keeps repeating afterwards. It was a crucial moment for me. Why? Because today, the European debate, again, dominated by the French debate, I would say, is telling us that diversity is a challenge to secularism, but diversity understood in a sociological way. Whereas, for them, diversity understood as a premise was the grounds for the republic. So it's actually quite important to even think further on this comparison. Now, what was the opponents of these Republicans? What was the argument of the opponents? Here you have Mr. Frappel. Frappel is actually a bishop, a monarchist in the parliament, and his argument is an argument of majorities against the premise of diversity. Again, for the Turkish specialists, this is going to be very familiar because Turkey, the debate is kind of confined in this majoritarian talk. Muslim majority country, and we don't talk about the rest. But that was the precise position that monarchists were holding at that time. And that even if there are some dissidents, we don't care about them. And if you see the response from the left, it's their right. You also have a struggle here between majoritarianism and a discourse of rights, and which actually pointing out another axis of struggle here. And again, a voice from the center left saying that, well, and you're getting your religion from the priest, so why do you also want to do it in the school? This is Jules Ferry, the Minister of Education, and one of the most important figures, Prime Minister also as well, during a certain period of the Republican Opportunist Group. This was the governing Republicans at the beginning of the Third Republic. It was a coalition, and in fact, I'll try to show you later on that this group resembles early Kemalism quite more than some other of the currents at the time. And you see here how, again, it's the same point, but with a bit more emphasis maybe, that the Republicans are struggling against the argument of majorities. Okay. Now, this is the group that comes out as a surprise. And I would say it's the group that's really factored down in a lot of the accounts of France, but also in the general discussions today, this is a position basically, the affirmation of the person is less important because this position can also emerge from other political groups. But the person is basically arguing that we have to, like the germs of those grand principles, we have to put basically in the spirit of a child some sense of God. In other words, let's not teach Catholicism as a tradition, but let's abstract from religion a certain morality, and let's just teach them the general idea of God, and this is compatible with the Republic. This is actually the group that the book put digs out, both in 19th century France, in contemporary France, and in Turkey, past and today, and calls them state civil religionists. This is quite important because in today's discussions, this group is totally lost, and I'm guessing a lot of the time they're present somewhere under the claim to liberalism. Now, just to give you a bit of a further sense on the ruling Republicans against Jules Ferry, one of the important figures of ruling Republicans, and their position is anti-clerical but not anti-religious. And for him, basically, we're going to secularize the school, but we're still going to keep paying the clerics. Oh, it's stuck. Okay. Now, if you go on to the law of 1905, again, the same emphasis on diversity is there in the making of the law. And this is from the Briand report, The Socialists. And this is also another point I would like to really emphasize, that the socialists are totally lost from the current debates. I mean, take this one example, a book that's been really popularized a lot, Ahmet Cruz's book, and the distinction between passive and assertive secularism. In that book, the passive secularists are Turkish Prime Minister of the time and the French socialists. So basically, the book is telling us that the Prime Minister of the time in Turkey is a French socialist. So I'm guessing that, I mean, the Turkish leader would disagree with that more than the socialists probably. So it really gives you a sense of how deductive work has taken the place of inductive work in all this debate. And and it is not only in the case of Turkey. If you look at, for example, Charles Taylor, A Secular Age, or the recent book with Jocelyn McClure, all the debate is about these rigid secularists and more liberal secularists. Whereas, what we have in the separation debate here is that you have a group of anti-clericals that want to push religion out, that a group of pro-religion, in other words, mobilizing religion group. This is not a very uniform group. But then you have the French socialists in the middle that basically make these two parts. These two parts, one part who wants to mobilize religion in public space, the other one who wants to demobilize it. It's the French socialists that make these two groups talk and push the separation law. So in other words, the fact that French socialists are not given their own group, own particularities, is quite interesting in the current literature, because without them, this law was not passing. It was impossible. Again, in this report, what is quite interesting is the reference to the United States. This is the reference to the Federal Constitution of the United States. And the book actually traces these references and what kind of understanding of the US dominates in France. Is there a uniform understanding in an attempt to talk to also the literature on interactive interaction histories. I thought it was really interesting because most of the French debate is self-referential. You don't hear a lot about the fact that they actually discussed the US, and Tocqueville was not the only parliamentarian who traveled to the US. There were many others. And this is the parliament. In other words, the parliament that discussed the report that I just briefly went over. You have radical left, radical socialists, all for separation. socialist parliamentarians all for separation, Action Liberal, and this is the political Catholic group, and you have these two groups in the middle that are a bit more unstable. So the task of the French socialists was to win that group, significant amount of group, that group to the other side, that 55 seats. With basically how, again you can see it here, and that's where a lot of the uncertainty is. But we can go back to those charts later if you like. But this is where the biggest circle turned. This was Article 4 of the separation law, and the debate was basically when the state returns property back to the church, to which church is going. And the political Catholics did not want separation at all, but the more center-right Republicans, a group called Republican Progressists, who actually resembled later Kemalism much more, in my analysis, they were really worried that the church, the property that the state is giving back is not going directly to the Catholic Church. And the radical socialists, all on the left side of the chamber, were basically saying that Catholic is whoever he says Catholic or she says Catholic. So whoever gets together, forms an association, can say, we want this property and we'll take it. Whereas the center-right Republicans were saying that no, that the right Catholic is somebody who's basically in line in the hierarchy. It has to go to somebody who's connected to the ecclesiastical hierarchy. It can't go to anybody. So, in order to resolve this conflict, the socialists presented this amendment, which basically says that the property will be returned to those who are actually going to ensure the practice of that religion. It was a general statement, but it was still trying to make sure that this law was not going to hit another blow into Catholicism. This is Albert Demont, the leader of the political Catholic group, a very clear statement against neutrality, that he doesn't want neutrality. And what is really striking in this definition is that actually this political Catholic leader's definition of neutrality is the same as the French socialists would define it at the same time. So again, given this current wave in the literature now of multiple modernities and everybody is entitled to their own understanding of neutrality, equality, all these kind of things, it's very clear that the Catholics understood neutrality the same way the socialists did, they just didn't want it. And again, divine law is important to kind of create more obedient subjects. And here comes another interesting turn on that other variable I was tracing, that is the comparison itself. What was quite interesting is that while the socialists were reading the United States in an institutionalist way, the Catholics were reading totally in a sociological way. That is, we don't care about the institutions, look at society. So Tocqueville said that, so Roosevelt pushes for the combination of force with religion. So we have to kind of emulate not American institutions, but American social societies, behavior and organization. So what was really striking here is that, again, there was not one US. In other words, political interest was able to divide the interpretation of the US in the parliament. Okay, so this was basically, in that debate on the Fourth Amendment, this was the moment where the leader of the Republican Progressists, which I before called the center-right Republicans, who do not want to kind of allow the property to go to other people than the Catholic Church, were basically pushing an argument of fact, which was quite interesting. So we have to take religion as a fact, and at the same time make sure that we don't guarantee or impose it, but the property has to go to the bishops in line with the hierarchy. And what is quite interesting is the response of the socialists to this kind of argument. And the response is that basically the Ribot in the previous slide is saying that, wait, we don't want you to interfere in the internal organization of the Catholic Church, and therefore we want you to give the property back to the church. But from the point of the socialist, law or modern law has to be general. So the problem starts the moment you say church, not when you say give the property to the church. So his argument was that laws have to be general. We cannot pronounce the church in the law. So therefore, telling them that they are the ones who interfere in the internal matters of religion and not the socialists. So it really gives also a lot of interesting clues on how modern law is also a part of this discussion. And of course, given also individual rights, if you look at the last quotation here, where I underlined, he said, well, I mean, if some Catholics challenge a hierarchy, do we have a right to say no? I mean, they have an individual right to also redefine church doctrine. Okay, that basically ends what I have to say on 19th century France. And on contemporary France, what is quite interesting is that this is a speech of Sarkozy that he gave in Lateran Palace. And what you see here is a double emphasis, an emphasis on diversity, but also an emphasis on Christian roots. And at the same time, and because a lot of the time Sarkozy has been taken as recognizing the Muslim minorities, doing things for them, pushing the establishment of the French Muslim Council, for example. But at the same time, it is forgotten that Sarkozy was not only, in order to get the votes of the Muslim community, trying to give something back, he was also pushing religion in general. In just in a more diverse way, but religion in general. This is again from the book he wrote before he came to, he was elected president, that religion is the panacea for violence, drugs, and all these materialist problems that we find in the French suburb. Now on to, again, I mean, during the question and answer period, I can say a bit more contemporary French, but I really want to move on to Turkey. Basically the punchline in the book, or the comparison with France, is that, I mean, France with Sarkozy was regressing, because all the debate was about how he was reasserting secularism, but in fact, laicite was regressing because it was playing this double game of pushing religion in general, but at the same time making a claim to diversity. The first comparative question I dealt with in the book was whether CHP in its early years was Republican opportunist, the Jules Ferry group that I talk about, or communist. Why is it important? Because most of the attempts at comparison put Kemalism with communism, because they were both quite strong on religious groups. However, institutionally speaking, at one point, communists actually agreed to separation, and Kemalists never did. So I never drew these comparisons to a conclusion very strongly, but I've put out enough material at least to question the existing established views on these. But so Republican opportunism was much more close. And here you go, for example, to 1928, the second man after Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, Mr. İsmet Pasha, and France, when they're pushing for the removal of Islam from the constitution in 1928, his statement is almost the same as the statement of Jules Ferry. We are anti-clerical, but not anti-religious. We are not, it should not be an advocacy of religion. This is 1946, after the transition to multi-party system in Turkey, and here you have, during the parliamentary session on the national budget on education, is a push to re-establish optional religion courses in the Turkish public school. And here you have, again, very interesting references to France, but the bottom line is that the French public satisfies their religious needs by its own organization. Since we don't have our own organization, the state has to do it. We need religion to fight communism. This is basically the moment that I argue the Republican People's Party of Turkey is turning more Republican progressist, as in the 19th century French case. And again, basically we have to teach more religion. But the crucial point, for example, in this passage, in this argument, this is from the Congress, 1947 Congress of the Republican People's Party, that the point about we should teach more religion comes right after the argument that revolution has been embraced. Which is really interesting because in the Columbus story in late 19th century in France, basically when the Columbists are convinced that revolution is embraced, they say, okay, then separate. They don't say more religion. Again, 1980 military coup. I mean, these are, actually, I mean, they're kind of, the general story is known, but this kind of detailed quotations are not explicitly from the Constitutional Assembly debates. Instead of, say, Lenin, Mao, and Castro, that the kids read religion. And again, really interesting references to Europe. And now, last part of the presentation, the AKP. One really interesting observation that I would like to share is that that first point out there, this is the percentage of the budget that's spent on the salaries of imams. What is really interesting in that is that the Welfare Party, which was actually both banned by the Turkish National Court and also by the European Court of Human Rights, was spending much less on religion. So there was speech, right? I mean, that speech is a big example, was a big evidence both for the European Court of Human Rights and for the Turkish courts to ban the party. But in terms of action, they were spending much less on religion, and this actually graph, that ends in 2011, but it actually goes way further to show that the AKP has been spending much more on religion. Now, a very crucial point, however, this, I mean, right now, given the current turmoil, social, political, and economic in Turkey, I'm, for example, expecting a new literature that is going to tell us that there's been a paradigm shift. I mean, imagine if you were part of this moderate Islam or moderate Islam compatible with democracy scholarship, which is quite significant in the United States. What are you going to do now? You can either change yourself or you're going to claim a big paradigm shift. I don't think, analytically speaking, you have many options. So I'm expecting, maybe I hope I'm wrong, but rather than trying to do a more in continuum emphasizing the deeper roots of the current changes in Turkey, arguments of big paradigm shift. That's why I really singled out these parts of the book to share with you. For example, this is 2005, very early, where everybody was applauding liberalism and democratic tendencies of the party, and here you have an AKP parliamentarian telling us from the parliament, dialogue between religions and the elimination of conflict among them is applaudable, yet the competition among religions will last as long as the world exists. Or 2005 again, Prime Minister, religion is the cement of society. So in other words, the simple message here is that if you were reading the parliament, there were still enough clues scattered around there that there were certain tendencies. And of course, this is not to deny that with 2010s, or maybe a bit earlier, the discourse, the talk, and the practice, not only talk, gets radicalized. This one, AKP spokesperson, 2010, in defense of the restructuring of the Director of Religious Affairs, where the hierarchies in the Directorate was increased, more money, but also more areas. Basically, he says, the religion of Islam cannot be confined and practiced within the four walls of the mosque. We have to diagnose, it has to basically diagnose all kinds of problems in society and attend them. This, I also wanted to share with you, I mean, how I bring a lot of different methods here. This is just a sequence chart of events that I did. And what I would like to underline here is basically this moment, 2008, the Alevi workshops. In other words, the government sat down on the table with Alevi organizations. This is a group, minority group, let's say, for the lack of a better term for now, non-Sunni. And they said, we'll sit down and talk and see what we can do for further democracy and your rights. It's a very important moment because, again, coming back to this question about is there a paradigm shift today, I rather prefer to take a moment where AKP's claim to democracy was at its peak and to see what happened at that moment. Now, what happened was, number one, the workshop first started with Alevi organizations. Then the conclusion was that this is too serious. We can't only talk to Alevis. We have to talk to everybody. So slowly, faculties of social science, the group is getting better. Society is being built in some sense, or its representation. Societal, media, politicians, so 7 workshops after that. Point 2, the talk of the talk started right after the 4 court decisions. It's a bit hard to read, but these are basically national and international decisions that concluded that a citizen of Alevi origin has a right to have her kid or his kid be exempt from the religion courses. So the government said, let's talk, right at the moment that rule of law judged against it. So it's actually a very interesting moment about democratic theory as well, how much talk, how much rule of law, when. Now, number 3, what happened at the end, the academic, the scholar who was leading all these workshops was employed by the director of religious affairs. He was pulled into the state after getting all the information of society. There was a new law of the director of religious affairs. It gave nothing to Alevis and many other developments. So it's not only that, the moment basically ended up with no outcomes. It ended up with outcomes to the opposite of Alevi demands. And here, just a few again from the material quotations. A leader of one Alevi organization, basically repeating what I just said. The National Courts and the European Court of Human Rights basically decided against you, so now you want to share the space. 2, this is the AKP parliamentarian who was the architect of these workshops. I interviewed him in 2016. He used a popular Turkish phrase, "Dostlar alışverişte görsün." Let people see us shopping. So in other words, and he actually said, can you imagine, these people, they had never seen a 5-star hotel. So the government invited them, hugged them, fed them, and said, we are brothers, and sent them back. And nothing happened at the end. These are 2 participants discussing. It's actually my favorite in terms of explaining this procedural iron cage that the AKP semi-intended, build as you go, built. One of them says, this is workshop 7, discussing after like 8 months. And one of them says, we're back to where we started. And the other one says, no, we are not back. No, I think we're back. So this uncertainty, this actually, I just read a book called Governing Gaza, where the concept of abeyance is super important. So you have a moment of like abeyance, total uncertainty. We don't know where we're going, and then real political interest push through. And here is the minister responsible of the Alevi workshops, and so much for dialogue. The big debate in the workshops was they asked the Alevis to define themselves, and they refused a definition. So the minister says, but if you come out and say, let's not talk about this, then as the person in charge here, I will also pose the question. Why should we? What is it that you do not want to talk? What is being hidden? We got to know all parts on the Alevi question very well, let me tell you. Therefore, an approach of the sort that only those things we like could be spoken is not correct. My knowledge, my habit, a self-centered approach is not correct. If that is the case, then I represent this thing. Classic. And then we move on to the new law on education, 2012, a very sad moment of some sort, given history, because the education system, like in the French case, that is the key and the pillar of Turkish society, was dismantled. And this dismantling was already hinted at. The dismantling happened in the March of 2012. And the dismantling, it was basically hinted at earlier on by the Prime Minister. With all kinds of references. Again, very Sarkozy style, like, what do you want? No religion. Do you want the kids to be drug addicts? Kind of statements. There are many points to be discussed here, but I really would like to move on, not to hold you further. And this is actually where I would like to conclude. So this law basically put more religion courses. It was quite interesting because I remember the 1980 coup when the Republicans were trying to justify the fact that they're going to teach religion. And they were saying, well, how do you bring the Republican religion together? Well, it's not exactly religion. What is it? Culture. Okay. So now, the argument was, well, it was not religion. It's culture, so we have to reveal religion. These abstractions are super important. They are not just discourse. I will be happy to talk about that more. Two, this is a moment where what I call first laicism, laiklik, stops to be the reference point in Turkey because the text is simple. Go to the parliament records, push in laiklik, 3 appearances. Nobody even says the word. So again, coming back to this contemporary debates on meaning, I'm like, well, I mean, there's not a different meaning of secularism. There's just no reference to secularism, so it's another thing. The last point is, while this discussion is happening, the police is basically demobilizing Euphemism for what's going on outside the parliament. And speech breaks. I call it end of speech moment in the parliament. I have never seen such, I mean, people cut each other in the parliament, but this is very special. So basically, this is the AKP parliamentarian talking. He says, the education system, which has been shaped by the intervention of guardian institutions, will be returned to normal according to the demands of the nation. Applause from the plurals. A CHP parliamentarian. According to you, is it democratic that the buses on their way to Ankara are stopped? When the AKP state imposition has ended, a BDP parliamentarian. You are even silenced the language of the church. We want that there is structure that adjusts the system according to person, and not one that adjusts the person according to the system. Applause for the plurals. The state has to meet the demands of the continuously diversifying and changing society. And MHP parliamentary says, do you yourself believe? So I'll end here. Thank you for your time. I'm really sorry if I took a bit long. It's very difficult for me to